see if we can get something up there. Okay, so let's kick off. There's a lot to cover. Hopefully we'll give you a bit of an overview firstly on the security side, which hopefully everybody is relatively familiar with. And then we'll look at some of the specifics that we get with Office 365 and then some of the advantages and add-ons that Microsoft 365 gives us. So it should be obvious to everybody, excuse me, today that security is something that doesn't really have an endpoint. In this day and age, more people are getting into IT, more devices are connecting, so this is going to be something that's going to be ongoing for quite a period of time. Now, that obviously is a challenge, but that's also a revenue opportunity. Now, the other thing to remember here is that we can't just turn security on. A lot of it means that we need to adjust it for our users. We need to work out exactly what level of protection they need, where they're taking devices, which environments, whether they're standing behind a desk or whether they're moving around mobile. So again, a lot of this is policy based. So that's where, again, consulting will come in to allow you to focus that security on that individual client. So unfortunately, the downside with security is nobody's going to ever call you and tell you everything is working and everything is secure. That's something that you'll need to monitor and maintain. That'll mean obviously charging for the monitoring of that, also going back and making additional recommendations as different facilities and resources become available. So one of the things about security is it's pretty much sight unseen, so you obviously need to spend the time and make sure that you educate your customers and let them know and show them the reports that they are being protected, and obviously go back and revisit that on a regular basis. Now, from a user's point of view, is they don't really want to know about security, they just want things to work. So we need to balance up user productivity versus security. If we make things too secure or too difficult for them to use, they'll simply work around things and use technology such as shadow IT to get around what you've set up. So again, it's a balancing act here to work out what works best in the environment. Now, security primarily is about reducing risk. We can't eliminate risk, all we can do is reduce it. So one of the best ways to do that off the bat is to reduce the surface area of attack. So some of the standard things you should be looking at doing is turning off unneeded protocols. So if you're using Exchange mailboxes, all Exchange mailboxes by default have POP3 and IMAP enabled. It's very good practice, I would suggest to you, to turn that off for mailboxes because that is really not required for most users. And things like disabling or deleting users who are no longer inside the organization. So again, look at reducing risk by firstly determining what should be turned off or what should be disabled. And again, when we start turning security up a notch, we are going to get the complaints from users that they may have access denied. In reality, that's a good thing. That means that the security is working and you want your users coming to you saying, look, I can't get access to this, and then it's just a simple matter for you to enable that. So another good example again is forwarding rules in emails. These are on by default, so this allows users to create forwarding rules in their inbox. Best practice today probably is to disable that for the whole tenant to start off with and have users request that forwarding rules are enabled on a one-by-one basis. So again, look at security as a firewall. The firewall basically has everything blocked initially, and then if you need to make any changes, those adjustments are made, audited, tracked, and logged. So again, IT security is the responsibility of the IT provider, and it falls to the business to manage and maintain their own security. So this means you can't abdicate security. The user can't just offload it and never have to worry about it. One of the key ingredients with good security is user training and user information. So a more informed user base is going to probably be your best defense against phishing scams and security vulnerabilities. So again, take the time to include the users in this security environment. Let them know what's going on. Obviously, don't sell it on fear, but again, show them what good practice is, what bad practice is, and how they can go about improving the security of the business and making your job easier. Okay, so we go to the next slide. Yep. All right, so let's go down. So generally what we've got to remember is the easiest way is never the most secure. This means that Office 365, Microsoft 365 out of the box is probably not going to be as secure as you could make it. This means that you'll probably need to go in and tweak the settings to improve, to lock things down, to implement additional policies. So you should have a standard process, a checklist, or a script that you run when you take on a client or spin up a new tenant that will make it more secure. And the way to look at security is that, like insurance, it's always important to have it beforehand because the recovery process is always far more expensive. So when a user loses a device, it's much better if that device is under management where you can remotely wipe it or track it or what you need to do, rather than having to take some of the other actions you may have to take in recovery. So again, this is the important thing to get across to the management, let them know that if there is a vulnerability or if there is a security incident, that it's going to take a lot more time to generally clean up and cost for them. So again, preventative measures are always a good investment. So we need to, again, look at our own security situation. How secure have we got our information? Are the devices that we're using, our mobile phones, our iPads, our laptops, are they encrypted at rest? Do they have BitLocker on them? Do we have our information being secured correctly? If we need encrypted emails, have they been set up? So what's the situation today? Again, it's a balancing act, but the first thing to do is, again, evaluate the environment and determine what can easily be turned on to make the environment more secure, and then what can be turned off or disabled to make it more secure, and then we add our policies on top. Now, the most likely entry point is going to be email, and generally what happens is once a user gets in, or once a bad person gets in, they will then use that to move them around the organization, look to elevate their privileges, and basically they're going to sit in there and going to monitor the organization and look for other vulnerabilities or other ways to attack. So that initial entry is very, very important, and this is where it comes down to the more difficult you can make it on that initial entry, the more likely the attacker is to move on to the next target. So in this day and age, again, having some basic security in place is going to prevent probably a large majority of the incursions that we see. But remember that the initial entry is always the important thing. How do they get in? And typically these days it's going to be email. How do we secure that? How do we prevent our users from accidentally giving up their credentials? And if we do have a security incident, what action needs to be taken? What impact is it going to have if we get something like CryptoLocker in that does spread across the organization? Then what impact that's going to have? Can people still work? How long does it take to recover their files? So again, some sort of analysis as to what is the likely scenario in case of a security incident is important. So if a user's credentials are compromised, how long will it take for them to reset their password? What will they have access to? Again, that's an important thing to look at and assess. And as I mentioned, assessment is a very, very important thing. It's not something that's done as a once-off. It will be done on a continuing basis. It can be done with a lot of automated tools, but again, there's going to be new entry points, new vectors, new ways of gaining entry into the technology, and these we'll need to take advantage of and make sure that we are mitigating the risks there. So we're going to constantly need to be assessing our environment and the users that are working with it, what they're using, how they're using, what devices they're using, and so on, to help them minimize the risk. So probably, excuse me, one of the biggest challenges we've got in the security world is the fact that when you are working to prevent security incursions, you're going to have to sit there and defend against every single vulnerability. That means whether it's in email, desktop software, from a USB drive, from devices, from malware, from all sorts of things. So on the other side of the equation, however, is that if anybody wants to get in, they only need to find a single exploit. So what this means is that the odds are very much stacked against those trying to defend the environment, and that's why, again, it's impossible to remove risk. It's just a matter of being able to mitigate or to reduce that as best you can, and that can be done generally with some very standard practices. It's not going to eliminate it completely, but it's certainly going to make it much harder and a less of a target for the individual or the company. So again, remember that no matter what you say, what we see in the press, it's always going to be a challenge when it comes to security and protecting users, because now there are just so many opportunities for attackers to exploit vulnerabilities. Now, if we have to go and explain security to our management, to our customers, we can do it very simply. We need to keep it as simple as possible to help them understand. This triangle gives people, I think, the best definition of security. The idea here is you can have two sides, you can't have all three. So the way to explain it is, excuse me, is to let them know that if they have a solution that is secure and cheap, it isn't going to be usable. If they want usable and cheap, then it's probably not going to be secure. So again, what you need to do is speak to your customers, speak to the management, and help them understand that security is a balancing act here. It's a matter of understanding, okay, where do we want to put our resources? What are we going to get back from that? So that triangle there hopefully should give you a simple way to go to them and say, look, we need to pick two of these sides. Let us know which two you want us to address, and then we can craft a solution for that. Now, as I've mentioned, the unfortunate thing about security is that in today's complex environment, lots of software, lots of options, lots of users, lots of locations, we have a very complex environment that we need to maintain the security of. So anything that we can do to reduce the complexity, to make it simpler, to make it repeatable, to make sure that we're applying the same policies across our organizations, the better it's going to be. We want to get things as standard as possible. We want to get it down to as few vendors or few different products as we can. And this is why I think Microsoft solutions now provide a very good way to reduce that complexity, all by a single provider. You're going to get solutions from the desktop all the way to things like email, SharePoint Online, files, and all that sort of stuff. So again, one of the big considerations in this environment today is that a lot of resellers have a lot of different security products, and it's just a matter of evaluating whether they still perform the tasks that are required, and is there something else that you're already paying for, or something else that is a smaller cost that will do a similar job or better. So again, one of the things we're looking at doing is to reduce our risk, and the way we do that is to reduce the complexity of our environment. Now, you might have seen this slide before, which will show you, again, a very typical style of environments we see out there. We see a mixture of desktop operating systems all the way back to Windows 7. We see on-prem environments that include things like small business server. We've got a mismatch of PCs and devices, employees bringing their own devices. We've also got a range of different software solutions for managing, doing productivity. And again, this is a very complex environment. There are lots of vulnerabilities here. We have unsupported, out-of-date operating systems. Yes, they may still be in use, but as I said earlier on, the fact that a security incident is going to cost you far more than looking at upgrading these environments. So again, if you look at some of these, they are significantly out of date. They're very hard to support, and they've got a lot of vulnerabilities that may or may not be patched anymore. So to improve the security, reduce our risk, we really need to make sure that our environment is as simple and as up to date as possible. So the argument here is keeping things up to date, getting on the latest material. Yes, there is a once-off cost of doing that, but that's going to reduce your risk and your profile much greater than trying to fix the results after a security vulnerability. Now, in today's age, not only do we have a monetary cost involved when there are security incidents, we are now aware that there is a notifiable data breaches legislation in Australia. This basically requires companies to notify people if their information is leaked outside the organisation, and this can happen very easily. The most common, I suppose the simplest way for this to happen is by a misdirected email. So we've all accidentally sent an email to people that we didn't intend. So unfortunately, if that contains sensitive information, then the organisation would need to declare data breach, and that can obviously have reputation damage, but also would need to be mitigated as well. So there'll be a cost for doing that. So again, the legislation applies to most organisations these days, especially around tax file number and Medicare number. Now, on top of the Australian legislation, we've also seen a growth in legislation around the world from different locations like Europe. So for those of you who aren't familiar, GDPR is in place now. This is a European Union law that basically protects the rights of the information for European citizens. So if you are working with European citizens, you hold their data, or your customers are, then they will fall under the GDPR requirements. Now, even if it doesn't, if you don't have customers or yourself that fall under GDPR, I would strongly indicate to you that this is probably going to become the standard that most other nations or organisations will look to adhere to. I've got a feeling that the GDPR, in some way, shape, or form, will certainly become very standard across most organisations and territories, because again, it's much easier to copy what somebody else has done. So again, we need to make sure that we're protecting it for Australian laws, but we may also be subject to international laws as well. Now, with this in mind, Microsoft has released and updated their Microsoft 365 Business product. That product is a combination of Office 365 Business Premium, security, as well as device management and administration. Now, the items that you'll see here in red are the items that have been added since the end of April. So they have added a number of features to the Microsoft 365 Business environment to make it probably, I would suggest, the hero SKU for SMB. So we've added things like information rights management, we've added data loss prevention, which I'll talk about, we've added the ability to do mobile device management with the full Intune, and we've got online archiving, and we've also got the ability to do legal hold. So a lot of these features have now been rolled directly into Microsoft 365 Business, as well as all the benefits we get with Office 365 as well. So in a little bit more detail here, you'll see that these are the new features that have been added since the end of April. You will get these slides at the end of the presentation, so you can look at it in detail. But some of the things here you'll notice is the Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. This is a sandboxing technology that allows inbound information, typically from email, like attachments, to be opened in virtual machines in Microsoft data centers to verify whether the attachments are malicious. We've also got the Exploit Guard, which is now integrated with the Windows Defender environment. We've got data loss prevention, which allows us a scanning technology to ensure that sensitive information isn't sent outside the organization, like tax file number. We've got Azure Information Protection P1, so this allows us to put the permissions inside our documents, so the permissions travel with the document no matter where they're sent on the internet. We get the full version of Intune that allows us to manage our devices, iOS, Android, and Windows 10. We also get Exchange Online archiving. So what that means is by default, the Business Premium mailbox is 50 gig is the max, but with Exchange Online archiving, that effectively means that the mailbox is now unlimited. So with Microsoft 365 Business, you're now getting an unlimited capacity mailbox. And of course, we get BitLocker enforcement on our desktops. Now, the other thing you'll notice here, which is a big change for Microsoft 365 Business, is the ability now to support hybrid Active Directory deployment. So this means you can use Azure AD Connect to synchronize your IDs up. It also means that you can look at doing more integration if you wanted to around ADFS and federation, but this is definitely a new feature, a new capability that they've added, so it is now a supported feature of Microsoft 365 Business. Now, what we'll see here is that all of these products that are being provided by Microsoft 365 Business may replace some of third-party solutions you have out there. So if you have a mail hygiene service, again, it's something to look at and consider whether the advanced threat protection provided by Microsoft 365 Business is able to relieve that or able to take over that capacity if you desire. Again, the other question I have around this is, are the third-party options that you are using, are they GDPR compliant? Are they notifiable data breach compliant? So again, all of these products need to make sure they conform to the security requirements, and having them from different vendors can make it a bit tough to do this. So that's why, again, strong consideration should be given to Microsoft 365 Business, which will roll all of these security features as well as the productivity features into a single solution for you. Now, as I said, you will get a copy of the slides afterwards, so again, you can have a look at this table in detail, but you'll notice that the blue items in the list there are the items that have been added to Microsoft 365 Business. You'll see that there are also E3 and E5 SKUs for Microsoft 365, as well as the comparison there to the standard Business Premium. So for about $10 more per user, you're going to get additional features like advanced threat protection, the mail hygiene. You're going to get a full version of Intune. You're going to get unlimited archiving of your mail, data loss prevention, information rights management, legal hold, e-discovery, compliance manager, and so on. So there's a lot of features being added in there, and that's why I certainly think that the Microsoft 365 Business SKU is now the hero SKU. Now, to really light up a lot of these features in this environment, you need to be looking at integrating the Microsoft 365 and Office 365 environment into devices, modern devices. So modern devices are typically Windows 10 Professional or better that are Azure AD joined. So get the most benefit from joining these devices, your Windows 10 devices, to Azure AD. You'll get single sign-on, you'll get policies that you can push down those devices, then put under management. And again, you get far more of the alerting, you get far more of the integration, because again, we're all integrated into a single environment. And because they're integrated via the cloud, this means that they can be monitored and managed no matter where they are. And one of the big things is that these devices are always up to date. So we can control the policies excuse me, in the back end using Intune and other tools to make sure that our operating system, our Office, and all those things are kept always up to date. Keeping software always up to date is certainly going to greatly reduce the risk to the users. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, there are a number of standard offerings that come with Office 365 already out of the box, and these are included in Microsoft 365 Business as well. But let's just run through a couple of these quick offerings just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So if you want to aware, basically all data in transit from Office 365 is encrypted. So we've got things like SSL, we've got TLS, we've got data center encryption as well. And when the data is at rest inside Microsoft data centers, it is encrypted in the databases it lives. It's encrypted with BitLocker, and it is basically also restricted access. So only a certain set of people can actually get physical access to the environment. So again, lots more information about this in some of the resources I'll give you at the end. Lots of good videos that shows the length that Microsoft goes to protect information inside its data centers. Now, of course, one of the most common ways, or the best ways, to prevent users being phished or basically having their credentials stolen, even if they do give them up, which they tend to do, is to implement multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication basically means the user logs in, they then receive a second code, whether it's from a mobile phone, a phone call, or a text message, or they type in a code from an app on their device, and that allows them to log in. So that means that if they give up their password in a phishing attack, then the attacker won't still be able to get access because they need that two-factor authentication. Now, obviously, this is a little bit painful for users, a little bit extra work for them to go through, but it's fairly common these days to protect user information. Things like their banking credentials, government websites, all that generally have two-factor authentication. So certainly should be something that's encouraged. And probably the easiest way for users is to use the push notifications. So if you have the Microsoft Authenticator app on your device, you can set it up so that the login process prompts the user. They just have to click on a button to approve the login, no PIN number required, and they're in. So one of the standard things you should be looking at doing across all organizations to improve the security is certainly to set the global administrators to have two-factor authentication, but also consider rolling it out seriously to all the users as well. Now, not only do we have two-factor authentication, we've also got other cool technologies in the Microsoft world like Windows Hello. So users don't like passwords, they don't work well with passwords, they generate the same passwords or very similar passwords. So one of the ways to overcome that is to look at using Windows Hello for Business. So this means that with a suitable camera on the device, you can look, the machine will automatically log you in by recognizing your face. You can use other biometrics, you can use a companion device so that the device will only be unlocked while the mobile phone of the user is nearby. Again, you can use fingerprint, and you can also use things like YubiKeys as well to protect it. So again, typically you'll need a Windows 10 environment to do this, but these other two-factor environments make it much easier for users and maintains that security. One of the big things I certainly suggest and recommend for people is the Windows Hello, the camera, the facial recognition. I found that to work really, really well and use that all the time myself. So not only out of the box can we do two-factor authentication with Office 365, we can also do some basic mobile device management. So things like conditional access, device management, and selective wipe can be done excuse me, out of the box with Office 365. But we're only going to be able to do a very, very basic set of these features. If you want to actually manage the applications on these devices, then we need to look at Intune. And again, remember this Intune is something that we're going to get with Microsoft 365. So again, we'll get the basic management, and then we can extend that with Microsoft 365 with a full version of Intune that will allow us to manage not only the devices down to a very low level, but also the software that is on those devices as well. Now, if you aren't aware as yet, what you can also do, Microsoft has now rolled out the ability to restore your OneDrive. So what we've seen at times, obviously, is users who have synchronized information to their desktop being crypto-locked. That then means, because it's synchronized technology, it synchronizes back to their OneDrive, and that means all the files in their OneDrive are also unfortunately encrypted. Now, Microsoft has rolled out now the ability to restore your OneDrive, so a user can just go in, pick what date they wish to go back to. They can pick the files they then wish to restore, and that will then take those files back to that time. Now, this is because OneDrive has version control. Microsoft has also committed to rolling this out for document libraries in Teams sites and Microsoft Teams. We should see that shortly. So that'll mean that if the files do get corrupted or do get encrypted by malware, that you'll be able to go back, select a location, a point in time, and then roll those back to that location to recover your files quickly and easily without the need to call for an administrator to do that for you. So again, that is available out of the box with Office 365 today, and we should see that soon for Teams sites and Microsoft Teams. Now, if you aren't aware, there is also some basic conditional access that you can implement. You can do this in the SharePoint Admin Center. So down the bottom there, you should see the option here to select device access, so you can control whether devices that aren't compliant or joined to a domain can connect to your environment, whether you want to block them. And the other option that you also have is the ability to actually specify by IP address location. So if you want to restrict users to only work, for example, in their office behind a static IP, you can go into SharePoint, you can put that IP address into there, and that will then prevent them from accessing it outside that environment. But again, be very careful with this. It's a very broad weapon here. There are better ways to achieve this with Microsoft 365, but if you want to, certainly out of the box with Office 365, you can do this today. So the place that you need to start when you're thinking about security for Office 365 and Microsoft 365 is the Security and Compliance Center. So if you haven't been to the Security and Compliance Center, it will look something like this. So down the left-hand side, we have things like alerts, DLP, data loss prevention, threat management, search investigation. So it's its dedicated console for security and compliance, and the features and functionality will vary depending on the license that you have in your environment. Now, inside the Security and Compliance Center, the first place I would suggest you go and have a look at, if you haven't already, is Microsoft Secure Score. So what Secure Score does for you, it will look across your tenant and give your tenant a rating based on the enablement of the security features in that tenant. And it will then provide a score. You can see a score analyzer up the top there that allow you to view that and examine that over a period of time. Now, when you look at Secure Score, you will notice that on the right-hand side, we're also given a comparison to what our current score is, as well as tenants of the similar size, plus the overall Office 365 score. Now, as you can see, the overall average Office 365 average score is only 31. All right, so my suggestion to you would be is to set a benchmark level for your tenants or your customers' tenants and say, look, we're going to make sure that all tenants we implement have a minimum of 150 or 200 or whatever, and these are the steps that we need to implement to make sure that they are secure. We can then demonstrate to our customers that we're taking security seriously by showing them how much more or how much above the average the environment that we have configured is. So at the moment, as you can see, a lot of tenants which come out of the box have the standard settings that no one has changed or configured or updated, and that generally equates to a very low score when it comes to this evaluation with Secure Score. Now, the second thing I would recommend in the Compliance Center that you go and have a look at is go and turn on the audit logging. So the audit logging generally is an on by default. You should go in and turn that on. It takes about 24 hours, I think, to activate once you've turned it on. That will then allow you to go in and run searches, audit searches through your environment. So in this case, I'm doing a search for a user who's signed into Teams. You'll see that I run that search between the 2 days. It will then give me the results from the audit logs. I can filter the results, and I can export those results also to a CSV file, so I can import them into Excel or potentially throw them into Power BI to get even more reporting around that environment. So if you haven't gone in and turned on your audit logs, please, I would strongly suggest you do. And I would also suggest that you go in and have a play with it and just understand and see how the audit logging does work and the detail that it does go down to. And that's across all Office 365 environments. Now, another thing here is that you can set up with all your tenants is what's called a retention policy. So the way Office 365 is working to retain information is by labeling. So what you do is you go in and classify your data or create a label. Maybe in this case, we're creating a policy to retain data for 7 years. See in the settings for this policy, I determine how long the data is kept, when from the point it was created. Do I delete it at the end of this period? How do I handle that? Okay, and you'll see there are advanced options you can go in here. Now, the way that retained data based on these policies is actually handled depends on the licenses that you have. But again, with Microsoft 365, we've got data loss prevention, we've got unlimited inboxes, we've got legal hold. So all of these policies are going to allow us to quickly and easily retain data for emails, files, and so on. So the way to manage the retention of data these days is, again, to use labels and have policies underneath those labels that you can then apply to different locations in your environment. And that means that once the policy is set, the information in there will follow those guidelines rather than you having to worry about it individually. Now, one of the add-ons we get with Microsoft 365, and I would suggest a standard add-on that should be added to any tenant, is the Advanced Threat Protection, or ATP. When we add ATP and we look at the threat management component of our compliance area in Office 365, we will see 3 new options here: ATP anti-phishing, safe attachments, and safe links. So the anti-phishing will provide additional machine learning and intelligence over the interactions between users and their emails, so inter-office emails. So this is looking to prevent the situation where an attacker manages to get the user's credentials, then sends the pay person a email requesting a major payment that gets approved, and so on, and they end up basically scamming money out of the business. So that's what anti-phishing will do. Safe attachments, again, is a sandboxed environment that will open attachments and then take an action on them, whether you want them passed through, quarantined, or blocked. And the last one is safe links. So if a user clicks on a link that isn't safe, they'll get a warning message via a proxy that Microsoft set up to prevent users from clicking on suspect links. Now, the other thing you'll notice here, which again, the bottom 3 are standard part of Office 365 and all Microsoft 365 as well, that has a standard anti-spam. Again, out of the box, remember that Microsoft 365's tenant, it has only the default settings. So I certainly encourage you to go and look at configuring the anti-spam environment to suit your needs and screw it down and make it a bit tighter. I would also suggest, if you haven't looked at things like DKIM and DMARC, which are two emailing protocol technologies that will again reduce the spam and false positives as well. And again, we've got the same idea here with the anti-malware. So all of these plus the ATP options are available to us in our Microsoft 365 environment, and certainly should be used and configured as appropriately. So as I mentioned, the ATP safe links, you've got an example here on the screen. When a user clicks on a link that is malicious, they'll be taken to a warning screen telling them this, and you, as an administrator, can determine whether they're allowed to click through this or whether they're not. The idea here is we've got intelligence in the back end looking at this and making sure as best they can that the links don't lead to malicious or phishing sites. Now, on top of that, in our emails, we've also got the ability to prevent information from leaking outside the organization. We do this with DLP policies, which we'll talk about shortly. That will allow you to scan email content, file content for critical information like tax file numbers, and then pop up warnings, take actions, prevent things from being sent outside the organization. You can determine that by the policy that you set. So data loss prevention is an outbound scanning technology looking for critical information that you don't want to necessarily share outside the organization. We've also got BitLocker enforcement. So again, we're going to be able to enforce our encryption at rest on our devices. So if the device gets stolen, it's fully encrypted, and again, not much use to someone who has taken it. And we also get the ability to manage all of this sort of software, Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, on our devices, iOS and Android, and we do this through our full version of Intune that comes with our Office Microsoft 365. Now, we can set up things like requiring a PIN number or a fingerprint when users access their corporate apps. So Outlook, if the Outlook app hasn't been accessed for, say, 30 minutes, they're required to put in a PIN number or verify their thumbprint on the device. You can also remotely wipe the device. If the user loses the device, you can initiate a remote wipe so that either all the corporate information is erased or the device is factory reset. So again, you've got this flexibility to do it in an emergency, but also do it if a user does leave the organization. We can also choose to have encrypted emails, and also, using the Azure Information Protection, prevent users from forwarding emails that they are sent. So our information protection will protect the content of the email and allow people to only maybe view and print it, but they can't forward it on to other people, as an example. So all of these policies are generally set using something like Intune. Now, retaining and archiving our email is probably the most important thing for most people. So thanks to Microsoft 365, we're now going to have the ability to do an in-place archive, so users can now keep that information in the cloud. We can have basically our governance over the top. We can set our policies, how long users retain information in their inbox, how long it's kept, maybe it's expired after 7 years, and whether we want to hold that information. So hold means that if I put a hold on a mailbox, it means that any changes that the user make are not relevant, or the user sees them, the user continues on, but in the background, every change is audited, tracked, and you're able to recover at any point in time. So the most common situation for legal hold is if you have a disgruntled employee, the last thing they generally do is shift delete all their emails. When you have that email box on hold, that means you can recover all of those using eDiscovery. So eDiscovery gives us the ability to search through current content as well as deleted content to find information and present that, and potentially export that to third parties like lawyers as well if required. So let's talk quickly about data loss prevention, so DLP. You'll see that you can create DLP policies inside Office 365 and Microsoft 365. These will, for example, scan for credit cards, Australian financial data, driver's license, tax file number, and so on, and they can be then applied across an area within your environment, whether it's a specific team site, specific email boxes, or whatever. DLP also allows us to do document fingerprinting. You can upload a document into the DLP fingerprinting area, and basically what that means is if a user sends a document that looks like the one that's fingerprinted, they will then be subject to that policy, and that may, for example, prevent them sending invoices or maybe things like medical reports outside the organisation. So we can look for specific numbers, but we can also look for document matches and prevent those from leaving the organisation. As I mentioned, we're able to use Azure Information Protection, which is now part of Microsoft 365, to encrypt the data. The actual file is encrypted using AIP. We can determine what users can do with that file outside the organisation. We can also track actions on that document. So what that means is that when a document is created, whether it's in Office 365 Box or Salesforce or whatever, we can detect the data type. We can then determine and apply a label that sensitive information. That then protects our document. Then no matter where it's sent outside the organisation, that's monitored, and we can also report and take actions after the event. So if I, for example, sent out a quote to people, and one of the people that I sent it to won the quote, I can rescind access to everybody except the one person that won the quote. So that's the control that Azure Information Protection and Rights Management is going to be able to give me. All right, so let's push the down arrow. Let's see what's happening. Okay, so in essence, basically it means that you can determine who the recipient is, the expiry, you can set an expiry date, determine whether you want notifications and what permissions the user has. So the user who it's destined for can read it, open it and work with it, but if they forward it on to somebody else, that user is prevented from accessing the information because the permissions and the rights are inside the document. So mobile device management quickly allows us to manage not only the device, the physical device, which we do with Intune, but we're also going to be able to manage the software inside it. We do that with a combination of Intune and our Azure Rights Management. So we can now fully manage our devices, the hardware and the software, and we can do things like basically allowing users to have some control over that using a company portal, an Intune company portal, and they can manage the apps that we select. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint are considered corporate apps that we can manage and prevent information being sent outside that. So they couldn't, for example, forward a corporate email out to something like their Gmail. So it prevents them from copying and pasting from Excel or Word or whatever to their Gmail and then sending that out to somewhere else. So again, that's the level that you can get to when you're using something like Intune to now control and manage the software and the hardware on these devices. So when a user buys a device or enrolls a device, they go through a certain number of steps here, which you can have a look at. But basically, firstly, the device is ensured that it is compliant. Maybe you don't want it to be jailbroken. And once it is compliant, it's joined to Azure AD. And then what happens is the policies that you set around that device are then pushed to the device. So you may set a policy in Intune to require users to only save corporate information into their OneDrive. So they can't save information created for a corporate environment into onto the local device. They'll have to save it up into Office 365. So you can determine and control all that. Microsoft 365, as I mentioned, has legal hold and also e-discovery built into it now. So that means that you can put on hold information so that no matter, even if it changes, the user changes after the fact, you'll also always be able to recover the original information. You can control how the users, how it's deleted, when it's deleted, and of course you can search across all your information quickly and easily from the security and compliance area, whether e-discovery or content search. So if you're looking for a particular email, a particular conversation from Skype, or a particular file, you can do that in the Security and Compliance Center. Now, as I mentioned, it is possible to do basic conditional access on devices and with Office 365, but Microsoft 365 and things like Intune and Azure AD Premium give you this ability thanks to Azure. So what you can do in here is you can go in here and be far more granular about who has access, what apps can work. So you may say that this app, for example, can be used inside the organization, but it can't be used out on the road. Now, all the other apps may work, so you can set conditional access potentially down to individual locations and individual applications as well. So this is the level you can do, and this is the control that you can get from a single provider like Microsoft now that we've got stuff like Intune and Azure AD in the background working to help us to provide better security. Now, the last thing that I'll mention here is that, in my opinion, there is nothing more important to an IT pro going forward than to know PowerShell. You certainly don't need to be an expert, you don't need to be a coding guru, but you certainly need to be comfortable using PowerShell in Azure and Office 365, because the quickest and easiest way to set these policies and configure it is to use PowerShell. In my example, I have a number of standard scripts that I run when tenants are spun up, or when I spin up test tenants. That ensures that I turn on the security I want, I turn off the stuff that I don't want, and I've got a secure environment to start with. So if you haven't spent time, if you haven't built up this library of scripts to configure devices, to configure your environment, you really need to invest in that, because once you get the script right, it's repeatable and it doesn't require someone to sit there and click through the interface and turn things on and off. So I cannot reinforce strongly enough that all of this at the back end really requires, and to get the most out of it and to do it in the fastest, quickest, cheapest possible way, is to use PowerShell. So become comfortable with PowerShell to reduce the time for deployment here. All right, I think there are some resources. Like I said, you'll get those slides after. You can have a look at that. And I think with that, I am now pretty much done, and I'll hand back over to Arun to continue on.